So one of your essay questions talks about the transmission of sound. So what is the first structure in your ear that picks up sound waves? The pinna, or the outer ear. So remember, if we were to kind of draw the pathway of sound waves, that's the outer ear. And then this is the auditory canal. And remember that in the auditory canal, we have ceruminous glands. So that actually causes earwax, right? So earwax. And sometimes some people specifically produce a lot of earwax, and sometimes it can build up in the auditory canal, and it can actually make it sometimes hard to hear. So if you've ever had that problem, it's amazing when you go to the doctor and they flush out the earwax because big pieces and chunks of it come out. And then all of a sudden you can hear. And it's like, oh, I was missing a lot because you just couldn't hear because the sound waves weren't getting through and into the auditory canal. But you have to be very careful using Q-tips to get out earwax, because if you push the earwax too far in, then normally the epithelial cells migrate from the inside to the outside. And so if it gets right up next to the tympanic membrane, then there's no way for it to naturally come out, although you can heat it up with water, for example, and cause your ears, and squirt warm water in there to cause your ears to kind of come out. So they recommend not putting Q-tips into your auditory canal to get the earwax out. Okay. So this is just kind of a side. So this is the ceruminous glands. And cerumen is kind of yellow, and it is antibacterial, antimicrobial. So it helps to protect the auditory canal from infection. Okay. So what structure comes next? Tympanic membrane. So the sound waves are going to vibrate the tympanic membrane. And then from there, it goes, those vibrations are transmitted into the middle ear and into what we call the ossicles. So the ossicles are ear bones. Not to be confused about what we're going to talk about next, which is ear stones. So these are ear bones. And we talked about how they are the malleus, the incus, and the stapes in order. Okay. So these function to amplify the sound. And then how does the sound get into the inner ear, which is the cochlea? Through the oval window, right? So inside the cochlea is where we have the hair cells, right? So we have bending of cilia on the hair cells. And that has, the hair cells that are bent have to do with the frequency of the sound. So that's the pitch. So the higher the frequency, the higher the sound. The low frequencies have low sounds. Sometimes men in particular have a hard time hearing the higher frequencies. That's why they don't hear you. They say, well, I can't hear you because your voice is too high. Okay. So from here, those the bending of the cilia causes transduction, and so it goes into the vestibulocochlear nerve. And that is one of the cranial nerves, and so this gets transmitted into the thalamus. And then where is it consciously perceived? Auditory cortex. Okay. So that's kind of a review of the structures in the ear. Sometimes you can get damage to the tympanic membrane. So if we look at the structure of the ear, Oops. I'll come back to that. Actually, let's talk about this. Yeah. Okay, let's talk about hearing disorders. Okay, so there's many, many things that can cause a loss of hearing, and sometimes it can be genetic. So you could have genetic issues, either with the nerve, like the vestibular cochlear nerve, or it could actually just be malformation of the inner ear. So the inner ear doesn't develop right, and so then you're born deaf, for example. It can also be due to injury. Right, so you could have brain injuries that damage the cortex, and so you're not consciously able to perceive. But you could also have injuries to the tympanic membrane. So if you've ever had your tympanic membrane rupturing, I kind of liken it to, it feels like you have tissue paper in your ear, right? So it's just like crinkle, 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 crinkle. Whenever you move your jaw, it crinkles, right? And so this can be due to a buildup of fluid in the middle ear. And so my nephew, for example, when he was a little kid, had chronic middle ear infections. And when he went up in the airplane, he was not able to equilibrate using his eustachian tube or his pharyngotympanic tube. And so his eardrum ruptured and a bunch of this green stuff came out. So there's a lot of controversy right now over whether or not tubes are a good idea. So if you can put in tubes that allow the fluid to drain.
What fluid are we talking about?
We're talking about fluid in the middle ear that specifically is associated with infection. So pus and stuff in that middle ear. So normally there's no, so we're not talking about the inner ear. So the inner ear is totally different. So we're talking about the middle ear, right? From middle ear. So the tubes, when they're taken out, there's a little bit of scar tissue, but also when your eardrums rupture, scar tissue also tends to form. So this would be like the formation of scar tissue. So your tympanic membrane is flexible, and so if it ruptures over and over and over again, then maybe that scar tissue is going to make it less able to function, less able to vibrate properly. So last time we went to the doctor, they said that they were, they didn't know whether maybe it was better to just let it rupture and then just naturally heal, or whether they should put tubes in, because both of them lead to scar tissue, a little bit of scar tissue over time. So I guess if you're constantly having your eardrum rupturing as a kid, then it might be better to have tubes in, because there's just one hole that allows it to drain. Did anybody in here have tubes in your ears? Okay, so it tends to be the older people. I don't know how old you're young, but I think it was a lot more common in the past. Yeah, I don't think it's as common today as it was in the past of putting tubes in the ear. Okay. We also talked about damage to hair cells. So this could be due to loud noises. It could also be due to infection, like viral infection. It can also be an autoimmune disease. So autoimmune diseases are where the immune system attacks the normal healthy tissue, and so this can lead to hearing loss. So there is a way to treat hearing loss, and one of them is just using hearing aids. Right? And these just amplify the sound. And I'm going to show you an example in a minute, or I'm going to have you listen to an example in a minute, what it sounds like because it doesn't really sound completely accurate, because in many cases it filters and changes the frequency. So it kind of changes, like limits the frequency of the sound, so there's less variation in the sound. Okay. We also have the cochlear implant. So what this does is, this is an electrode that gets put into the cochlea. That transmits electrical impulses directly to the nerve. And so that sounds very different from normal everyday speech. So if we,
like the one that's more popular if you have a child that's born.
yes, so if you have a child that's born with hearing problems, then and if they specifically, it has to do with the hair cells, then that's what they do, is they put the cochlear implant in there. So another effect, or another problem with hearing, is what is referred to as tinnitus. And maybe most of you have experienced this. This is ringing in the ears. So this can be also associated with damaged hair cells. So this is just a diagram I took off the internet that shows this damaged hair cells. Remember we talked about how they can be permanently deformed, and then you get a ringing and a fullness in your ears. Tinnitus can also sometimes be associated with equilibrium problems or balance problems. You'll also notice that there is an artery that runs really close to your cochlea. And so sometimes you can actually hear that pulse, right? Sometimes you can hear the pulse in your ears. And that's because of that internal carotid artery running right next to the cochlea. And also jaw problems can cause tinnitus and strange sounds because the temporomandibular joint is also kind of close to the cochlea. So tinnitus can be caused by a multitude, right? Many factors. So it is a symptom. Okay, so this is my cochlear implant. So if you see people, sometimes you can actually see them. They actually have a something to pick up the sound. So they have something on the surface of their skull. And then this microphone actually picks up the signals and turns it into speech. And then it sends the electrical signals to that transmitter and then into the cochlea. So this actually goes, there's a wire that comes through and then goes in and wraps around in the cochlea. So this is what the cochlear implant looks like. And so the hair cells themselves do not have to fire, but rather there's an electrical impulse here that then causes an action potential to be sent into the cranial nerve and then into your auditory cortex.
Is that on there permanently? Like, is that
Yes.
surgical?
Yep. So I don't think they take it off. Yeah. Although I think you can maybe you could unhook the thing that goes around your ear, but the one that's right on the outside of your head, I think that stays there. Okay, so I have a short little video or not video. So this is from Science Friday, but they have examples of the different types of how you would hear. And so this is the audio for what it sounds like if you are using a hearing aid. Oops, there we go.
Turn the lights out when you leave. The hot fudge sundae gave him a stomachache. Robins lay blue eggs. The radio and television do not wake me up. Have you ever seen a $2 bill?
Have you ever seen a $2 bill? Okay, so now maybe you'll feel a little bit more sensitive to people who have hearing aids and say, I couldn't understand what you said. Right? I couldn't understand what you, could you say that again, please? Because I couldn't. So I'm sure that if you listen to that over and over again, you would get better at picking it up. But one of the things that they said is that they've taken out the high frequencies. So they're only transmitting the lower frequencies, and you can kind of hear that the high frequencies were missing from the speech. So that is very different from the cochlear implant, which sounds like this.
In my mind to use number 2 pencils. I was tired of running in the sprinkler. She wanted to stay up past midnight. She checks out 3 books from the school library.
I don't. You'd rather not hear anything.
Yeah. I was just telling her, I was like, I would rather just not hear.
Yeah, those are the electrical signals. Yep, that are sent.
So when they have that, and you know the sound has to be transmitted, so does it not match up with their mouths? Then I'm assuming because.
It probably matches up pretty close.
Pretty close.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's probably pretty fast that's getting sent in there. Okay. So the last thing we're going to talk about in terms of sensory is equilibrium and orientation. So this has to do with the inner ear as well, but it's a part of the inner ear that's called the vestibule. So we have a part of it that is the saccule. There's 2 C's, saccule, and the utricle. So when we look at the saccule, it is up and down. So it is horizontal movement. So this would be like when you're traveling in an elevator and you can feel that sensation of moving up and down. And the utricle is vertical movement. So if we look at where these are, the saccule is underneath the utricle. So this is the cochlea. This is my saccule right here. And in the saccule, we have what are called the maculae. And the maculae, don't confuse this with the macula of the eye, like macular degeneration is in the eye. But the maculae have hair cells, and they have otoliths. So these both have maculae with hair cells and otoliths. So these are not ear bones, but these are sometimes referred to as your ear stones. And they're actually made of calcium carbonate. So put calcium carbonate crystals. So if we look at what those look like, there's a picture in your book. Okay, so this is the macula. This is actually of the one that's in the utricle. So this is the macula showing the hair cells, and then the membrane, and then those otoliths. So what it does is that it presses on the otoliths press on the hair cells and cause them to bend, and then an action potential is set. And so it can tell whether I'm speeding up, say for example in a car, or moving through an elevator, moving vertically or horizontally. So sometimes you can get damage to that, where you can actually damage those stones and those stones get out of place. And then that can lead you to getting what is referred to as vertigo. Vertigo is often associated with heights, but this is dizziness, right? And the feeling of moving, even when you're not. So there can be inner ear infections. And when the inner ear infections happen, this is very bad, right? So this is not like a middle ear infection. This is an inner ear infection. And when you get it in there, this is actually filled with fluid. So remember that these chambers, the vestibule and the cochlea are filled with fluid. And they're actually filled with some of the same type of fluid as your cerebral spinal fluid. So it's very hard to get an infection in there, but if it does, then it can be very bad. Okay, but that can lead to problems with hearing, but it can also lead to problems with balance and equilibrium. Okay, there is a disease which is called Meniere's disease, with a little accent marks here. And one of the beliefs about Meniere's disease, this is like long-term problems with balance, is this could be due to, or can be due to, excessive fluid in the vestibule. So one thing that they'll sometimes do for this is they'll put you on drugs that are similar to diuretics so that you get rid of excess fluid. So some drugs help with regulating the fluid balance in the vestibule and in that inner ear. But I looked at Meniere's disease and they said that there's no cure for it, but you can treat it through diet and medications. Okay? And I can imagine that this would be a very bad thing to happen. So like, for example, I decided a couple of years ago, I was gonna go on that round spinny thing at the carnival, you know, where it sucks you to the side. Because I loved that as a kid, you know, and I'm like, I'm going. My kids are like, we're not going. We're not going, Mom. I said, okay, I'll go. And so I was dizzy for like 3 or 4 days afterwards. And I was like, oh my gosh, did I do something to my vestibule, right? It's like, right? But finally it settled back down. But I was actually really worried because I'd be laying down and feeling like I had the bed spins just from spinning around in there. So
why is it that when you're a kid, you go all the time? I can't even really look at it.
I don't know. Also, you know, actually there's a theory that they become more, they're actually spinning faster, but I don't know if that theory is true. When I was a kid, they were much gentler rides. But I don't know if that's true. I don't know. I don't know why kids can do that as well. Maybe it's practice. Maybe it's because they are tumbling, right? And they're running around and they're flipping upside down and they're doing more acrobatics than we do. Because there is like, so I teach a class where we do a lot of turns, right? And when people first come in there and like they're 60, they're like, I can't do that turn. You know, it just makes me, I go like this, I turn and I'm like, I'm dizzy, right? And then after a while, they're like, I can't believe I can turn and turn and turn and I don't get dizzy, right? And so they can spin and spin and spin. And so the more you do it, the better you are able to, so maybe it's just you need to spin more. Yeah, you go out in the yard and just spin. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So there are no ossicles in the semicircular canals, but they're also part of the vestibule. So they would still be under the vestibule. So the semicircular canals have what are called the crista ampularis. Crista ampularis. There's 2 L's there, ampularis. And this is where you have hair cells, and this is a cupula. This is just a mucus membrane. And it is actually in the base of the canals. So there are not receptors all throughout the canal like there is throughout the cochlea. So it is only in the base. And so this is actually a electron microscope picture of showing the hair cells in the base. And those are located like right here in the base of the semicircular canals. And this is rotational movement. So rather than vertical and horizontal, this is rotational movement. And so when you spin, it causes movement of that fluid in the semicircular canals, which then move the crista ampullaris and then cause the hair cells to bend and cause an action potential to be generated and sent to the brain. So this just shows what happens like when you're standing still versus when you're spinning, right? And then something really interesting happens when you stop spinning. So if you spin and then you stop spinning, the crista ampullaris, the fluid will actually flow in the opposite direction. And so this will actually decelerate the action potentials being sent into the brain. So it moves in one direction and then you could almost feel like you're still moving, maybe in the opposite direction. There's something weird that happens with your eyes when you spin too. There's specific eye movements. Your eyes will go and move after you stop spinning in a certain direction because the eyes are coordinated with the vestibular apparatus to aid in equilibrium. Okay, so we are starting a new chapter today, and this is the endocrine system. So this is what produces hormones. And I wanted to emphasize the fact, and I will emphasize the fact, that the endocrine system acts in coordination with the nervous system. But however, hormones, as opposed to neurotransmitters, so we'll put versus neurotransmitters, are long-acting. So for example, when we talk about hormones that are being released, they get released into the circulatory system and they go out to the body and they are there for a long time and they could cause a much longer response than neurotransmitters. If I wanted to send a signal, I have to keep stimulating the neuron to release a neurotransmitter, and so the neurotransmitters tend to be shorter acting, right? So cycles tend to be associated with hormones rather than neurotransmitters. And they're also slow acting. So they're not as fast as neurotransmitters. Okay. So if we look at some of their actions, what they do in the body, one of the things that they can do is that they can stimulate secretions. So they can cause cells to start to secrete substances. So for example, insulin causes cells to release glucose into insulin causes cells to take it up. So glucagon, which is the opposite of insulin, glucagon causes the liver to release glucose into the blood. It's opposite. Opposite of insulin. Okay. They can activate and deactivate enzymes. Okay. They can cause cells to undergo mitosis. So those are just some of the actions that hormones can do. So then we're going to talk about the types. So this is et cetera. We'll put et cetera. There's more, actually a lot more. We'll talk about those as we get to them. Okay, so types of hormones. They can be classified as either being lipid-based. And what this means, lipids are insoluble in water. So if they're insoluble in water, they actually have to be transported by a protein in the circulatory system. So they must be transported using a protein. So even, for example, the steroids, which include, so this includes the steroids, which are like testosterone and estrogen. And there's different types of testosterone, dihydrotestosterone, and there's different types of estrogen, estradiol. But these are lipid-based. So they're not soluble in water. So there's actually proteins that transport. They're lipoproteins that help to transport testosterone in the body and transport estrogen in the blood, because the blood is water. So we have to be able to transport them. We don't want them clumping up and not moving with the fluid in the circulatory system. The other thing that's really cool about the lipid-based ones is that they can move, so I'll put here, they can move directly into a cell. So directly through the outer plasma membrane of cells. And so this is why when you talk about steroids, you can actually apply them to your skin, right? So a common steroid that women use when they get older is progesterone. So progesterone cream, you just rub it into your skin and it goes right into your circulatory system and right through your cells, right? So it goes right into the body. And so they actually then bind to receptors on the inside of the cell. So we'll call these intracellular receptors. And then interact with DNA. And in this case, they can turn genes on and off. So a few years ago, there was some articles about men using testosterone cream and then interacting with their young children, and how that was actually getting transmitted to their children, because they were like hacking their children after they put on their testosterone cream, and then that was influencing like hair growth and development in the children, specifically young girl children who wouldn't want them to have excessive testosterone. Okay. Then be a little bit careful about your testosterone and estrogen and progesterone creams, because they interact directly with the genes.
Weren't they saying too there was a body wash that was doing residue from showers was getting into the
Oh, interesting. So there's some chemicals in our body, in our environment that mimic steroids and specifically mimic estrogen. And so I wonder if it was a synthetic chemical or was it I can't imagine bathing yourself in testosterone body wash or estrogen body wash, but maybe, yeah. So it could be that the kind of the sad thing is that there is, I guess we could talk about this now. There are synthetic chemicals that mimic steroids. And these are sometimes referred to as endocrine disrupting chemicals. And one really common one that you might have heard of is BPA. So that's bisphenol A. And does anybody remember or know where BPA comes from? Plastics, right? So this leaches from plastics. And so this was a big deal because the woman who first discovered this by accident in her lab when she was studying cancer cells, she discovered that the cancer cells were actually behaving like estrogen was present and they were actually speeding up their reproduction, even though she hadn't added estrogen to her plastic test tubes. And so she then tested the solution in the plastic and found that there was a chemical that was behaving like estrogen. So this is actually BPA is an estrogen mimic. And they're finding that, you know, all of us have BPA in our systems now. And so they can sample your blood, sample your body, and almost everybody has BPA in them. And so this is also believed to be possibly the reason why people are heavier than they used to be. So sometimes they call these obesogens, because this might be the reason why, if you look at people like 30 years ago, they tended to be much slimmer than your average person today. So maybe it's not entirely that we are eating more, but rather that we have these endocrine disrupting chemicals that are affecting the weight gain. So that when you have estrogen, we tend to gain more fat, right? It helps to store fat. And so perhaps these chemical disrupting chemicals, or these endocrine disrupting chemicals are making us more fat than the average person was 20, 30 years ago.
What kind of plastics is that found in generally?
It was found in all kinds of plastics that were like malleable. So not hard plastic, but everything that was soft. So it was water bottles. And it was specifically bottles that we were giving our kids, like baby bottles, and the nipple of the baby bottle also. And then kids' toys, plastic toys that they would put in their mouth and chew on them had BPA in them. And so, yeah. So that's why now you see BPA free everywhere, you know. The linings of cans are particularly a problem, specifically if the stuff in them is acidic. So the lining of tomato cans used to have BPA in it. So you can get BPA free or plastic free cans now. So when you look in a can, sometimes it's lined with plastic, and that proved to be a problem. So that's all that our interaction with the DNA. Okay. So there is another type of hormone that's actually much more common, and these are water-based hormones. And actually, sorry, not water-based, protein-based. Protein-based hormones, and these are water-soluble. So they do not need to be transported via a protein because they're already proteins and they're soluble in water, but they cannot enter the cell directly. Okay, so they can't enter the cell directly. So they bind to receptors on the outside of the cell. And then those receptors then cause chemical transformations to occur, which ultimately cause something to happen in the cell. So they have to have, for example, this is most of the hormones. Including growth hormone. So growth hormone, you think, oh, big muscles, but this actually also influences the growth in your bones. But the growth hormone is not a steroid. So human growth hormone, or HGH, is a protein-based hormone that's produced by your pituitary gland and then travels via the circulatory system and can cause the long bones to lengthen and to grow. So if we look at in your book, there are some diagrams that show the two different actions of these hormones. Okay, so these are water-based hormones. So these would bind to a receptor. And then notice that they cause a series of, this is sometimes referred to as an enzymatic cascade. So they cause this activation of enzymes that eventually activates something that triggers a response in the target cells. So activates enzymes, stimulates cellular secretions, opens up ion channels, or causes mitosis to occur. But notice that the hormone itself cannot gain direct access to the inside of the cell.
You said water.
Protein-based, yeah, sorry. Protein-based hormones. So this is my steroids. They go right through the lipid membrane, the phospholipid membrane, because lipids dissolve in lipids. And then the receptor is on the inside of the cell. It binds to the receptor, and then it can gain access to the nucleus of the cell. And so this would be your DNA. So this hormone can bind to, with its receptor, can bind to the DNA, and it can turn a gene on. And in this case, it turns the gene on, so messenger RNA is transcribed, and then a protein is produced. Right, so the new protein is produced. And so steroids are very powerful because they have this direct link to the DNA. Okay. So there's two different ways we can actually three different ways that we can control hormonal release. So 3 mechanisms. The first mechanism is what is referred to as humoral. And humoral refers to the body fluids, so the body's humors, which would include the blood, but would also include the interstitial fluid, the fluid that's around and inside of your tissues. And so you can have a hormone released based upon the ion levels or nutrient levels in the blood. Okay, so nutrient or ion levels in the blood cause a hormone to be released. We could also have a neural mechanism. So neural means nervous system. So the nervous system sends a signal, which is the action potential, to the gland and causes a hormone to be released. And I think this is one of your essay questions. And the big example of this one is the direct connection between the sympathetic nervous system and adrenal glands, right? So adrenal glands can release norepinephrine into the circulatory system. And this is actually aids in developing that fight or flight response. The adrenal glands also produce other things like stress hormones. So the nervous system can stimulate stress hormones like cortisol to be released. And we'll talk about the adrenal glands in detail, probably on Wednesday. Okay. The last one is hormonal. So we actually have hormones that cause hormones to be released. And so these hormones are called tropic hormones. So anytime you see the word tropic in the word, like adrenocorticotropic hormone, that means that it is not going to act directly on the tissues, but on another endocrine gland. Also, sometimes we have stimulating hormones. Oops, hormones. So for example, thyroid stimulating hormone. So this is actually produced by your pituitary gland, and then it travels to the thyroid gland, and then it causes the thyroid gland to produce thyroxine, which helps to speed up your metabolism. So you want to, in your essay question, give specific examples of this, of how these act. And there is a really nice diagram in your book that looks at the 3 different mechanisms. So the first one is humoral, and it talks about calcium levels in the blood. So there is a hormone called the parathyroid hormone that regulates calcium. So it would actually increase calcium levels if the calcium in the blood is too low. And we know how important calcium is to both the function of the muscles and the nervous system. This is the adrenal gland. Specifically, the medulla of the adrenal gland is actually nervous tissue, which can release adrenaline or norepinephrine. And then we have all these other hormones that affect other glands in the body. I'll talk about that in a minute. Okay. So we're going to talk about the hypothalamus, and remember that the hypothalamus is part of the central nervous system. It's actually part of the diencephalon. And you remember that the hypothalamus also helps with thirst and hunger, appetite, but it also helps to mediate the fight or flight response, the emotional reflexes, right? And so when we look at the thalamus, it has a nervous function, but it also has an endocrine function, and that is that it's directed, or it's connected to the pituitary gland. So it's connected to the pituitary gland. So the pituitary gland is often called the hypophysis because it hangs below the hypothalamus. And I ran out of room here. Let's see if I can open hypothalamus. The hypothalamus actually produces hormones. So these can be tropic hormones, that act on the pituitary. So a really important one in terms of the reproductive system is what is referred to as the gonadotropic releasing hormone. So gonad means what? Actually means ovaries and testes. So tropic means that it's acting on, and this actually releases two hormones that directly interact with the ovaries and the testes, and these include FSH and LH. So these cause FSH, and I'll define these on Wednesday, and LH. This is in the pituitary gland. And then these go to the ovaries or the testes. And they cause the production of egg or sperm. And they also cause the production of estrogen or testosterone. And in the case of the ovaries, estrogen can then interact with the lining of the uterus and cause it to thicken or to slough off. In response to the cycle, the menstrual cycle. So this is produces hormones, so it produces tropic hormones, but it also produces the posterior pituitary hormones. So there's two posterior pituitary hormones that are actually produced in the hypothalamus and then transported and stored in the posterior pituitary. So when we look at these include oxytocin and antidiuretic hormones. I'm going to leave a little room for these. So oxytocin is a really interesting hormone because it is released in response to touch. So for example, when somebody hugs you, or when you get a massage, or when somebody lovingly touches you, oxytocin is released. It is also part of the letdown reflex in milk production. So during lactation. So it's kind of interesting when the baby latches on, it's actually the act of suckling that then causes oxytocin to be released and then causes the milk to flow. So it's kind of frustrating for babies because when they first latch on, they don't get any milk, and it takes a few seconds of them suckling generally for milk to come down. Although some women have a really good letdown reflex, and so just the thought of nursing, or just the thought, or just hearing the baby cry, for example, sometimes they'll accidentally let down their milk, right? And then that's why you put pads in your bras to soak up the excess milk that's coming out. Right? So that is oxytocin. It's also part of birth. So it actually increases contractions during labor. Okay. So what is synthetic oxytocin that is sometimes put in intravenously into women who are in labor to speed up labor called? Pitocin. Okay. So synthetic is Pitocin. Right, so that's just synthetic oxytocin. So oxytocin is believed to create connections between individuals. And so it's really important. I read this really interesting article once that talked about how it's really important to be very careful about the relationships you get in with like the person of an opposite sex. So for example, you like kind of like them, right? And then you start touching each other, and then you start getting addicted to their touch because it releases oxytocin. And so even though there might like not even be somebody you particularly like or somebody that is good for you, you can become addicted because of oxytocin. And so that it leads to depression when you break up with somebody because you're not getting that oxytocin high or the rush of having a person around you. And so that's why they always recommend that if you're going through a breakup, is that you get massages, and so that you keep your oxytocin levels high, so that you don't kind of, get really depressed. Lack of oxytocin. Okay. So this is antidiuretic hormone is ADH. So like it suggests, it decreases the production of urine. So with ADH, we increase the retention of water. I also read that it takes 20 seconds of a hug. So like if you're hugging somebody, you want to just hold them for 20 seconds and then you guys can both have and also something that's interesting is cats and dogs also have a release of oxytocin when you pet them. And so you're petting them, you're getting the oxytocin high, but they're also getting the oxytocin high by petting them, yeah.
I actually just did this.
Oh, cool. Oh, cool. Today?
Yeah.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
Okay. So this increases or decreases urine production.
How long was your speech? Too long. It's always too long.
Okay, so that decreases your urine production. Yeah, so I think it's kind of interesting that cats can become just addicted or dogs can become just as addicted to you as you are today. It's called love. It's called love.
Yeah, I found that there was a study on it. You just stare into their eyes. It's not even actually touch it.
Oh, really?
I believe that it increases your oxytocin level.
Right. Cats, not so much. Cats don't.
No,
They avoid eye contact. I don't know if you've ever noticed, but you try to look in their eyes and they don't want to look you in the eye because I think that's a sign of aggression for cats. Okay, so we'll stop there for today and we'll talk more about the pituitary gland.
You really look into it all the time. Did you get dog points? I think that is the stupidest thing. I've done it too. It's like, but it was really good speech. Like she said, it was really passionate and everything, but it's like.
I think it's stupid.
I felt good about it.
I got a whole grade dog one time. How do you switch go like 30 seconds over?
I got sleep for you. Why last